The biggest differences between Flesh and Blood and Yu-Gi-Oh! Welcome to the Fabled Academy. My name is Alex and I recently made a video talking about why it was one of my best decisions to quit Yu-Gi-Oh! TCG and actually start a new journey on my TCG hobby. And there was a comment on that video asking which TCG I'm playing nowadays, and it is actually Flesh and Blood. And I love to compare Yu-Gi-Oh! To Flesh and Blood because I still love Yu-Gi-Oh! I follow it around sometimes and I notice a lot of similarities and also differences between those two TCGs. And that's why I'm making this video, letting you know what are the biggest differences in my opinion, letting you know about the experiences I made, and also I think the more positive side for Flesh and Blood. And that's why I'm also playing Flesh and Blood much more often nowadays. So let's jump into it. The first thing that I want to mention is the play style, because actually I started to play Yu-Gi-Oh! Back then when it was very simple, but all the way until 2019 when the game has quite evolved a lot, right? And I have to say, modern Yu-Gi-Oh! These days is really different than what you are used to playing in Flesh and Blood. Modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Is kind of like solitaire, right? There's usually a player going off for 15 or even more minutes, building his board, and then the other player is hoping to either throw in some hand traps or then afterwards blow up that board that the first player was making. And that is actually a really one-sided game style, right? And also the increase of hand traps in the decks is not really for me anymore, to be honest. In Flesh and Blood, on the other hand, it's a much more back and forth between those two players playing the game. It is much more going to the edge, and the outcome is also determined much more by the fact who is the more skilled player and who is actually making sure to utilize on all of the resources in the deck. Also, I think it is very important to notice here the difference that in Flesh and Blood you're drawing a fresh hand every turn, and that also the game is lasting over multiple of turns rather than only playing 1, 2 or 3 turns in Yu-Gi-Oh! I think actually that talking also to the makers of the game of Flesh and Blood, that Flesh and Blood is a lot more like the early days of Yu-Gi-Oh! Where it was also a lot more needed to handle the resources over the course of a longer game, and also a lot more back and forth between a player playing out a few cards, maybe summoning 1 or 2 monsters, setting some cards up, and then seeing over the course of the game who's the better player. Like in Goat and Edison, for example, which you can also play nowadays in those Time Wizard formats, right? I would highly suggest that if you're interested in hearing more about this, actually check out this interview that I made at the first World Championship for Flesh and Blood with Chris Gearing and Newson Zheng, who are working at LSS, and specifically Chris Gearing being involved in the early days of Flesh and Blood, where he actually also tells in the video that Flesh and Blood was played much more like Yu-Gi-Oh! In the beginning, and that also the background of him and James White, also having a Yu-Gi-Oh! Background, influenced the making of Flesh and Blood. I also think, talking about the playstyle difference here, that the high-tier players in Flesh and Blood need to handle a lot more to be at the top than the Yu-Gi-Oh! Players. Not meaning in any ways that either of both sides are putting in more effort. I think Yu-Gi-Oh! Is also a very skillful and also a highly time-intensive game to play, don't get me wrong. But what I mean exactly is that in Yu-Gi-Oh! You basically only have to learn one format to actually be one of the top tier players. So you need to be good and construct it, right? You need to construct a good deck, or you either need to net deck a really good deck. And in Flesh and Blood, you actually need to be good in 2 different formats if you want to participate in either the World Championship or the Pro Tour, which are the 2 highest ranked tournaments in Flesh and Blood. And those players in Flesh and Blood need to be good at first, of course, in Constructed, but also they need to be good players in Draft. And we don't even have a draft format in Yu-Gi-Oh! So I think it is very interesting for Flesh and Blood players to dive into those 2 different formats, which I have to say I really enjoyed the Draft. And I wouldn't even experience Draft if I would have stayed in Yu-Gi-Oh! Honestly. To be fair, I made a video already about this, comparing Yu-Gi-Oh! Worlds to Flesh and Blood Worlds. It is titled, Is Flesh and Blood the most competitive TCG out there? And there I also talk about the differences between the World Championships. And at a certain point, I think Yu-Gi-Oh! Actually has a more competitive World Championship compared to Flesh and Blood, because in Flesh and Blood you can kind of buy yourself into participating in the World Championship, and in Yu-Gi-Oh! Only a handful of players really need to earn the invite to the World Championship, and so it's a little bit more elite in Yu-Gi-Oh! To be part of the World Championship, right? So let's actually come to the second difference here between Yu-Gi-Oh! And Flesh and Blood. And for me, that is actually a really important part of the game, for both games actually. And that is, how long can you play your decks? And if you're a Yu-Gi-Oh! Player, you might be thinking, yeah, I can't really play my decks that long if I want to participate in the high tier meta. And in Flesh and Blood, on the other hand, we have the Living Legends system, which also helps with the meta, but also helps a lot more decks sticking around for longer. So I think really the Living Legends system, at first I was a little bit skeptical, but so far for the last 3 years, I learned to love it, honestly. The Living Legends system, for those of you who don't know it, is basically a system where if a deck wins a big tournament, that deck gets rewarded points. And if they are reaching a certain amount of points, then the deck rotates out of the meta and can't be played in Classic Constructed anymore. But the deck can still be played in the Living Legend format. We will talk about that later in the video. And if you're looking at the Living Legend leaderboard for Classic Constructed, which is the main format to play in Flesh and Blood, you really see that on the top of the list, there are still heroes being played that are being played on a powerful level, like Dash, Azalea, Viserai, that are out for a lot of time. If you're looking at how long these heroes have been out, it's actually 4 years, guys. You could play these decks for 4 years straight. Of course, the decks are not equally powerful during those 4 years, but it is really nice to see that you can lean into a deck and enjoy it for a long period of time. That has a lot of benefits, right? Which we will also touch on later on in the video. But for now, let's touch on that, how long you can play the deck actually. I want to mention though, of course, in Flesh and Blood, there are also decks that can be played for that long, and that are the most overpowered decks, like Bravo Star of the Show. Though if I compare the length of time that we could play Bravo Star of the Show, it's actually kind of comparable to Yu-Gi-Oh, right? Maybe even a little bit longer. You could play Bravo Star of the Show than some of the decks that you need to play in the Yu-Gi-Oh meta. But Bravo Star of the Show, fair enough to mention him here, is one of those heroes that you couldn't really play that long. But like I mentioned, you can still play Bravo of the Show in Living Legend, right? So let's talk about those heroes that you could play for the longest time actually in the game, and that are close to Living Legend. Actually, Viserai is a really important hero in the current meta. It's a very powerful deck. I also think, looking at him, he still has 200 points left, so it's safe to say he still will be available for the next meta at least. We also have Kano, sorry guys. Kano is also a very powerful hero, both in Classic Constructed and Living Legend, but Kano kind of has his times. Sometimes he's kind of out of the meta, and then he jumps back into it. And Azalea is also a hero that was an underdog for the longest time, and then when Outsiders came out, Azalea could really shine, and there are different strategies even in Azalea that are viable in the current meta. So all of these heroes are on the top. So talking about Azalea and Viserai, Kano is a little bit further down here with 700 points, and still they are going into their 5th year. Show me like 3 to 5 decks in Yu-Gi-Oh! That you can play for 5 years straight, guys. And that are changing up and always evolving further. Like, there are not that many, right? Okay. Actually, I think the balancing is the point here, right? In Yu-Gi-Oh! Of course, Yu-Gi-Oh! Is out for much longer. It is power creep to the moon. In Flesh and Blood, we also see power creep. But it is not, of course, as high as in Yu-Gi-Oh! Because the game is not out as long. And honestly, I'm very interested to see over time how the power creep in Flesh and Blood will evolve. When we look at the game in 5, 10, or 15 years, will it be as fast as Yu-Gi-Oh! Actually, I doubt it, because I think really looking at all of the different tournaments at the moment, also looking at the recent World Championship in Osaka, between where the winner, Gregos, won $100,000, and we will talk about that difference to Yu-Gi-Oh! Later on in the video as well, had in the top 8 5 different decks. So we had 2 Enigma, 2 Aurora, 2 Dash, 1 New, and 1 Viserai. So 5 different decks in total. And even the 2 Enigma builds were very different builds. The winner was running a Count Your Blessings version of Enigma. And Valentin wasn't running Count Your Blessings. So if you want to count that in, it's maybe even 6 different decks. It's a really diverse meta. That's what I want to say here, right? That also shows like how interesting it is, I think, to be a Flesh and Blood player compared to Yu-Gi-Oh! Of course, you also have different decks in Yu-Gi-Oh! But I don't think really that Yu-Gi-Oh! Is that diverse in the meta always. Of course, we also, to be fair here, have certain times in Flesh and Blood where we see certain heroes dominate the meta, but even in those times, in this year, with the Zen meta, in part the Mistveil, it showed actually that Uzuri was jumping in and winning that tournament where everyone actually thought that either Zen or Nu was winning that tournament. So there are even ways to bring an underdog to the top in Flesh and Blood. Of course, that also happens in Yu-Gi-Oh! But I think it's just a much more common thing to happen in Flesh and Blood compared to Yu-Gi-Oh! I also want to say here that the diverse meta is also seen not only in the World Championship itself, but there are multiple running tournaments often in Flesh and Blood. So if you're running into the World Championship, you have a calling also. And even in the calling, there were 7 different decks, showing that Flesh and Blood is truly diverse when it comes to the decks that can compete at the top here. Let's actually come to a very interesting part of that. How long can you actually play your deck in comparison to Yu-Gi-Oh! And that is, I think, the mid to lower tier decks can also shine in Flesh and Blood. Making a good example from this year is actually coming from the heavy hitters season, Maximilian Klein's deck list that he piloted to the 2nd place of the Pro Tour. Like I said, that's the second highest tournament in Flesh and Blood. And he was playing an underdog for the longest time, being the Rinthia Iron Song, of course. And that meta specifically, the Rinthia was a top tier deck. But even though he was going to the 2nd place with her, you can still play her. If we are looking at the Living Legend leaderboard, actually, I need to look kind of closely here. Dorinthia is at the 11th place here with 590 points, so it's pretty safe to say that you can play Dorinthia during the next year for sure. And it's quite interesting, right? If you're playing Dorinthia for a long time and suddenly the meta comes for you, that Dorinthia can shine, and you can play her even after that meta, it's kind of crazy, right? Going back to that Living Legend format though, I really want to point out here the difference on how long you can how long you can play your deck is not only in the main meta, the classic constructed meta, or the Pro Tour and Worlds meta, but also in the Living Legend format. Because basically, even when your hero that you're playing at the moment is going to Living Legend, you still have the opportunity to play that hero in the Living Legend format. And there are even tournaments going on that are kind of similar to a YCS, like a Calling or a Battle Hardened, that are played in the Living Legend format. So even if you're saying, okay, I only want to play that one hero straight in Flesh and Blood, you still have the chance to play that hero in the Living Legend format after it goes off from the classic constructed side. Let's come actually to the third difference that we are having between Flesh and Blood and Yu-Gi-Oh! That is the impact of bans and why certain bans are made. Starting off, of course, the similarity between Flesh and Blood and Yu-Gi-Oh! Is that we have the ban list at first and that it is updated quite frequently during the year. Looking at the ban list for Classic Constructed here, of course, it's a much lower amount of cards on there compared to Yu-Gi-Oh! Because Flesh and Blood is quite new, right? It's only 5 years old. But in this year, there were quite a few cards coming through the ban list of Flesh and Blood. And that's why I wanted to talk about this specific topic in comparison here. Because I really think that bans are not made to clear up the meta in Flesh and Blood like it is used to be in Yu-Gi-Oh! And I remember playing the game from 2016 to 2019, and always people are so afraid of the ban list crushing the value down of their Yu-Gi-Oh! Decks. And honestly, of course, the bans in Flesh and Blood also crush the value of the Flesh and Blood cards. But I think it is much different how they interact with the ban list. I want to make an example here from the recent year with Zen, Tamer of Purpose. Coming also from the second difference that we already talked about, how long you can play the deck. Zen was kind of shut down at first. He was not shut down actually, he was shortened down, right? With those bans that we have seen with Art of War, with Orion of Mystic Tenets, with, where is it? The tomes, of course, here. The tomes that were also banned, but you don't play those in Zen. But what I want to point out here is that even after the bans, Zen is a top viable deck even. I think he's much more healthy now for the meta, right? But if we're looking at the deck list here piloted by Charles Dunn from the Calling Amsterdam, which he got first place with his Zen deck, I just mentioned those bans, right? Also, Bones of Ancestry was banned. Art of War, we talked about it already. Orion of Mystic Tenets here too. And after those bans even, they made an announcement to why they are banning the cards. They made a whole article about it, laying down basically why they did it in the first place. And that is a big difference, right? Not only why they are making the bans, so they are not making the bans to just simply prepare yourself for the next set so you can buy the new cards. They are really wanting to enhance the game experience with the ban list and also listening to the community in order to see what they can do to enhance the gameplay. The point with Zen here, though, with a recent example from the Calling Osaka, we already talked about it, the event that was going on, with the World Championship. Zen also got the first place at the Calling here. Zen is not the hero between that wins all of the callings, just because I take Zen here for the 2 calling wins. But this is a very different build, right? We're not seeing, of course, the ban cards in here, but still you can play him on a really powerful level. And also with a recent example here from the Battle Hardened in Geneva, I think really that the bans are much more healthy in Flesh and Blood compared to Yu-Gi-Oh! And we already talked about the bans crushing the value in Yu-Gi-Oh!, right? In Flesh and Blood, like I said, I don't want to say that the bans in Flesh and Blood don't crush the value, because if we are looking, for example, at Art of War, it was a 30 card before the ban list and then dropped down to 10 to 15 euros here. Of course, the value of your Flesh and Blood cards will also go down, but also the Rainbow Foil versions, right, are an important part to mention here, because we have a reprint policy in Flesh and Blood that is saying that the rainbow foils from the main sets, from the booster sets, are not reprinted again with the same artwork and rainbow foil. And that is a difference I really love in Flesh and Blood. Because when you collect these cards, or when you are playing these cards, and you know that these cards won't get reprinted in the foiling that you have, that's kind of nice, right? That's a huge difference here. Also, a card from the ban list, of course, that we saw that was going down in value is the Tome of Fjendal, which is now sitting at around €2. Before it was like €4 to €5. But also the rainbow foil version here holding the price a little bit better, right? It was 35 to €40 before, and now is sitting around 25 to 30, just to give you an example here. I want to talk about the value though, specifically coming back to Deck Flair's video here. What is the most expensive TCG? And I think the comparison between Yu-Gi-Oh! And Flesh and Blood is that interesting, because actually when you're looking at the cost of the decks, they can be quite similar. Only with the difference, of course, that, like I said, the value in your Flesh and Blood decks is retained much longer over time compared to your Yu-Gi-Oh! Decks. We will point out later in the video some of the negative points about that, because actually what makes Flesh and Blood decks as similar in price as Yu-Gi-Oh! Is also part of the reprint policy. Like I said, you can read that up here on the Flesh and Blood TCG side, with the rainbow foils being included here. But what is not really mentioned here is that they are really conservative when it comes to their reprints of their staple cards, which means that these staple cards are not only viable for a long time, like the Fjendal Spring Tunic, for example. So you buy it once and then you can play it for a long period of time. They are also not reprinting it over and over again, which was a problem at some point for Fjendal Spring Tunic. Then they reprinted it in bright lights again, and then the value came down alongside with them releasing some options that you can choose over Fjendal Spring Tunic. But nowadays, like I said, they are not reprinting cards as often as in Yu-Gi-Oh! Because they actually want to preserve the value in the secondary market, which also leads sometimes to certain cards creeping up in price even, and then those cards being a little bit expensive for newer players. That is not really a thing that I love in Flesh and Blood, I have to say. It is nice though for the players being in the game. Of course, they have cards that are increasing in price and that they can enjoy for a long time. That's the good thing. But Command and Conquer, of course, is the underlying example here for a card like this. I want to say though, like, if we are comparing Yu-Gi-Oh! To Flesh and Blood with these staple cards here, which I also made a video already on the channel about, Flesh and Blood being super expensive, it's said that, like with Fjendal Spring Tunic or Command and Conquer, you're buying these cards, these generics, they are called like this in Flesh and Blood, once, and then you can play it like throughout all of your different decks. If you want to switch decks up, of course, just like you have Ash Blossom, for example, or Nibiru in Yu-Gi-Oh! I really want to point out, though, that we are coming to that later, that the value is a thing, right? It is nice that the cards are retaining value, but it is also for the newer players a little bit frustrating that cards can be super expensive. So I would, it's a double-edged sword, right? Actually, let's come to... Actually, this is something that I want to point out later in the game. This is something I want to come to now, because this is a huge difference when we compare Yu-Gi-Oh! To Flesh and Blood, right? It's the pricing, actually. And we saw players running away from Yu-Gi-Oh! Because of the pricing that they have in the tournaments. And so I wanted to point out here the prices that you're getting in Flesh and Blood in comparison. For the next year, they announced that they have a world tour, which also means that they're doing a kind of similar thing like Magic does, which means that they are wanting to crown their players of the year, but also they are giving out cash prizes, and they did that always. You really can, if you are a really good player in Flesh and Blood, win big money prizes even. Also, you have, of course, those prize cards. And I think if I look back at Yu-Gi-Oh, I always loved the prize cards. Of course, I wasn't buying the prize cards to play with them. That was kind of a controversial thing in Yu-Gi-Oh, right? I also made a video on the channel about that, comparing Yu-Gi-Oh to Flesh and Blood with the prize cards only. There are 2 videos, I think, that you can check out on that topic. But I want to point out that I think the vibe that Yu-Gi-Oh had back then with the prize cards, if we look back at it, was kind of unique, right? Bringing out new cards that are prize cards and that only those winners of the tournaments can get. With Flesh and Blood, they are doing not the same, but they are doing something very interesting that is called gold foil prize cards, along with the money that you can win in the tournaments. Actually, gold foil prize cards are cards printed in the gold foiling that are already existing in the game. Either they are treated with the gold foil border and they are only brought up in a limited amount, just like the prize cards in Yu-Gi-Oh! Too, but you also know the numbers. You actually know how many are in circulation and printed for those prize cards. So the value of the prize cards is also determined by that, because they are collectors specifically only collecting the gold foils. And also there are these special extended art gold foils, like the Crown of Providence or the Balance of Justice, that only the winners of the callings can get. And that makes it really interesting if you think about it, because usually these calling winner promos are really expensive, like 10,000 euros or upwards. It's crazy, actually. And also, if you're looking at it, there are also like gold foils for lower tier tournaments. Here with Majestics, Rares, and Commons. So legendaries are for the Nationals, Battle Hardens, and Callings. But then they are also for your local tournaments, the Road to Nationals, the ProQuest winners, and the PTI tournaments. There are Majestics, Rares, and Commons given out for gold foils. Alongside, actually, I didn't think about this, the PTIs. We talked about it already, comparing Flesh and Blood Worlds to Yu-Gi-Oh! Worlds. And what I meant by that you can buy into the Flesh and Blood World Championship is actually professional tournament invites that you gain in Flesh and Blood if you are actually having a high seed that you can use to participate in future events. And you can also sell these PTIs, which makes it an additional price that you can factor in when being a top tier player in Flesh and Blood. These PTIs, I think, are worth somewhere between $500 and $1,000, depending on the season. Then also they newly announced, which I loved. I was freaking out when I saw this. They're having gem packs now, because of course you also have those local armories, those bottom tier events, which I go to and which I also knew these are kind of similar to the OTS local tournaments. And newly announced for the next year in 2025, they are giving out gem packs, which are really similar, which are basically OTS packs for Flesh and Blood, right? You're getting packs with reprinted cards. Like I said, I'm really interested in this. If there is a Command and Conquer, for example, in here, bringing down the price of Command and Conquer and also making it much more viable for the newer players at the Armory, because you're getting these gem packs here, and they are having a full article on this too. I just wanted to mention this, comparing it also to the higher tier prizes. All right. I want to come to the end here, and I want to mention before I come to the last part here, that if you want to try out Flesh and Blood, have these Blitz decks, which specifically I think the First Strike decks are the most important ones to try out, the Terra and Aurora deck. Like we talked about a lot in this video, Classic Constructed is the main format to play in Flesh and Blood, but if you want to try it out, you can buy these cheap 10 euro decks here, or you can just try it out with the free IRA Welcome to Flesh and Blood decks that are given out at local game stores that are featuring Flesh and Blood tournaments that are just for free, so you can just check it out yourself if you like it. And then for Classic Constructed, they have these Armory decks, which they have a total of 5 at the moment. They are ranging from 25 to 50 euros, and you're basically getting a full Classic Constructed deck with even cards that are only printed here in the deck. Also, there are some reprints in it, but I would say really I'm playing KO, for example. It is a cheap way to get into Classic Constructed, but don't let yourself fool. Don't fool yourself. You still need to buy additional cards for the decks, even though I think the Armory decks are a fantastic product to begin with. Something that I want to mention here at the end is that I really love how Flesh and Blood and the makers of the game, Legendary Studios, are listening to the community. And they are also interacting with the community on a regular basis, like I showed you with the banned and restricted announcement article. And I also think that they are really addressing the community pain points. They are not only listening to the community, but they are also wanting to foster a mindset that they are actually tackling those pain points. And that is something that I honestly experienced like only a handful of times with Konami. And I love being treated like this. And it's really the only way I wanted to be treated when being in a hobby. I made a lot of comparisons here in the video talking about Yu-Gi-Oh! And Flesh and Blood. And though I still have a place in my heart for Yu-Gi-Oh! I don't think I would go back and play Yu-Gi-Oh! On a regular basis when having a fantastic game like Flesh and Blood around. Of course, it depends on if you have a locals for Flesh and Blood. But if you have one, I would highly suggest checking it out if you're a Yu-Gi-Oh! Player and you're not really satisfied anymore with the game. Because like I said, I think there are a lot of positive things to discover for a Yu-Gi-Oh! Player in Flesh and Blood that can be even similar to Yu-Gi-Oh! And I love to experience these things, and it always makes me smile, just like the gem packs that we have. And I'm really looking forward to 2025 being a Flesh and Blood player, with the new set The Hunted being announced, and with hopefully discovering much more similarities and also positive differences to Yu-Gi-Oh! Guys, thank you so much for tuning in today's video. And now check out one of the other videos on the Fabled Academy.